But now we're going to introduce our next speaker, Tessy Ojo. Tessie is the Chief Executive of the Diana Award. Tessie, good morning to you.
Hi, good morning, Steve. Good morning, Tammy.
Hi, Tessie.
And Tessie's also on the board of Comic Relief. I got to know Tessie, or perhaps a year and a half ago, through getting involved in some of the work that she's doing, and I've found Tessie truly inspirational the whole time. So we were so keen that Tessie should take part in this conference, and we know she has many good things to bring. So without further ado, Tessie, good morning and over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen so that everyone can see what I'm doing. Great. I just want to say it was so lovely to actually listen to Dr. Beckford. I want to tell everyone that you've just, talking about diversity of thoughts, you've just listened to a theologian for about an hour. Now you get to listen to a campaigner who looks at everything from a completely idealistic point of view. So whereas I think there's a lot more, maybe a bit more caution in what Dr. Beckford said, I really, for me, you know, why can't we have change and why can't we have it now? So welcome to my session. I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for having me here. It's, you know, I do love the option of, I wish we were all together, and I wish that we could all, you know, there's always something brilliant about being together and seeing everyone and just understanding what the audience is feeling. But I have to do this from my computer, and all I can see is my own pictures right now. So pardon me. I have the privilege of running the Diana Award, which is a charity legacy to Princess Diana, and I've run this charity for about 20 years. For me, there is something really, I don't know if it's anything to do with age or just to do with the fact that I'm lucky to live in the countryside, but this picture you're seeing is more or less where I love to spend a lot of my time, well, when I'm not at work. I find myself really loving nature because there's just something incredibly beautiful about nature and something incredibly lovely about being in the woods, maybe partly because I work in London and sometimes you get stuck on the tube and you have all of the challenges of being in London, and when it comes to the weekends, I just want to retreat and be in the woods. You know, and you know sometimes that you're beginning to have a reputation with your friends when from time to time, I have people who send me pictures when they've been in any form of woods or they see anything that's nature related, and I get pictures. That's how I know that I'm becoming an addict to being in nature. But you know, for me, I have to accept that this is a form of escapism for me, and sometimes I tell myself it's nothing to do with age. For me, it's a form of escapism from maybe the reality of the world that we live in and the world that I probably operate in every day. Because for me, I see brokenness in the work that we do or in the society that we do. I largely work with children and young people, and I see brokenness a lot. I see brokenness more from a brokenness because of a complex system of privilege that directly excludes and oppresses some. Brokenness, I suppose, from a system that creates access and opportunity for some whilst leaving some others behind. Brokenness, particularly when it comes to young people, from a system, and this always really upsets me, from a system that almost decides your outcome even before you're born. You know, a system that tells you what your life chances will be based on the kind of family that you are born into. A system that sometimes creates an overwhelming complex sets of circumstances that means that if you're from a BAME background, or you're from a BAME background, or like me, you have children, who are Black, you almost begin to teach your children from the day they're born that they have to work twice as hard to get half the acknowledgements that your colleagues get. A broken system that sometimes would rather jail its young, if they're Black, than perhaps put any effort into treating them. So this is when I talk about wanting to retreat to the woods or wanting to always be in the countryside. I know I completely come to terms with the fact that for me, it's a form of escapism, because when I look at my everyday work with children and young people, this is what I see. This is what we work hard at the Diana Award to fix. You know, young people who are battling with identity, young people who spend a huge chunk of their life being told that you will not be X because you are from X. Or the 13-year-old boy who said to me about a year ago, who said, I went to a session and he said, Miss, I know that people like me can never be X. And I broke every safeguarding rule on that day because I had to give him a hug. This was the very week I had just sent my youngest son off to university. And I couldn't help but hug this child, this 13-year-old boy who was almost as tall as me, and said to him, I literally want to break the system that tells you you can't be X, you can't go to university. And I said to him, my youngest son has just gone to Oxford. You will go to university, trust me. For me, fixing the system that I just described has been the crux of our life. And one of the things that we talk about at the Diana Award is about creating tremendous results for every young person. And for me, tremendous results has to mean three things. Tremendous results means that young people live in safe communities, living a life that is free of violence and discrimination, living a life that is inclusive, that allows them to thrive and not merely survive. That every young person has the potential to succeed irrespective of, and I use the word disadvantage of birth, I use that word intentionally, because I know that it is possible to change the trajectory of any young person, that every child has the opportunity for change through active participation in their communities. And I love that we have at the Diana Award spent 20 years, and I love that I have created a canvas over the last 20 years that has allowed us to do this and to see great, tremendous results for children and young people. But everything that I've just described to you is purely pre that world that we knew before COVID. Because when COVID happened, a lot of things changed. And we are only beginning to see, actually, to not necessarily treat it, but we are beginning to see the impact of some of these changes. And I know we're talking about breaking the cycle, but as we look at the cycle that has been before COVID, I want to help us pull everything together so we understand what the world was before COVID, but also understand what the challenges that COVID has brought, so that as we begin to look forward into treating this post-COVID world, and as we begin to look forward about what breaking that cycle means, that we take these two together, because that's the system that really needs to be dismantled. So COVID happened, and one of the things we did, or one of the things I chose to do very early on, was to help to have a good understanding of what the issues that what young people's concerns were, what were the key things they were battling with as a result of COVID. Three things came through for us. This was a survey we put out to young people, and we polled about 1,500 young people in the last week of March. So this was very, very early on. The survey went out between the 27th of March and the 5th of April to a wide demography of young people. And these were the 3 top things that young people told us they were most concerned about or they were battling with as a result of being in lockdown. Mental health, number 1. Breakdown in family relations, young people who, you know, perhaps were living in very chaotic family backgrounds or households, or, you know, being in lockdown meant that you didn't have enough space. Or the loss of skills. Well, at the time, no one knew that it might be up to 6 months of not going into schools. But even at that early age, young people were indicating that they were worried about the long-term implications on their life about the loss of skills. Now, knowing what we know now, we know that children's mental health has been hugely impacted as a result of the disruption in their education, the isolation, the fact that they haven't had the time to interact with their peers. We know that even pre-COVID, that there were lots of challenges around language skills and early development skills for particularly young children going into reception, and mostly reception or nursery, where they had very delayed communication skills. Now think about 6 months of being in lockdown. What does that mean for children? We know that we are also facing a generation of young people who didn't sit GCSEs or A-levels, young people who are now perhaps reliant on educators, perhaps the educators that they've had, educators who are, and I'm not generalizing here, but some of the educators who had biases against their own pupils or students, and now having to tell a young person, this is your grade. They are reliant on those teachers or professionals to tell them of their grades. A lot of young people, I know just in the past few weeks that we have had the first set of IB results, and as a lot of young people have said to us, I didn't achieve my grade because, surprise, surprise, that teacher who I never quite got on with didn't quite give me what I was expecting. We are facing a first generation of graduates who the Telegraph published the stats I think it was about a month ago, saying about 70% of new graduates from university just this year would end up on benefit because they have the likelihood of getting a job is very slim. We are going into a recession. That's 70% of possibly new graduates starting their working life on benefit. Finally, from all indications, we know that the economic impact of COVID is likely to aggravate and entrench those social inequalities that we've been talking about this morning, particularly in communities that are already disadvantaged, Black and ethnic minority communities. And so the real question is, what happens next? Knowing the pre-COVID scenario and the COVID scenario, how do we begin to move forward? How do we begin to break this cycle? And how do we begin the process of rebuilding our communities? And as I look at this topic of rebuilding, I know firstly that we have to rebuild as a collective. You know, we know that we have to me, I always think about that whole, I always talk about the village mentality, that it takes an entire village to raise a child. And I know that we will need to begin to rebuild, all of us as a collective, to ensure that we are rebuilding structures that allow every child, like I said, to thrive and not just survive. But I also know, obviously I'm talking again from a campaigner's point of view, that this rebuilding work must take various forms. There is just not one script around rebuilding. For some, it might be the Marcus Rashford kind of rebuilding, where he's used his platform to campaign, you know, to create change when it comes to offering holiday vouchers or meal vouchers to children over the summer holiday. Or for some of us, it might take rolling up our sleeves kind of rebuilding, But I know that whatever form of rebuilding that we're going to do this season, it has to be completely underpinned by relationships. And why do I use the word relationship? I know that what we need most and I'm looking particularly at communities that have been overly affected, in some way doubly affected, both by the structures that were built, the racist structures, but as well as the impact of that from COVID. I know that a relationship is key because relationship provides stability, hope, and growth. Relationship also ensures that the physical distancing that we've all experienced as a result of COVID does not lead to disconnection and disorientation. These three things in terms of stability, hope, and growth is what our communities need, and for me are the key ingredients to rebuilding. And so for the next few minutes that I have left, I'm going to look at three key levers of change. I'm going to look slightly beyond the education system, and I know we're really focused on education, but again, like I said, I'm looking at this from a campaigner's point of view around education, community, and business. And what role does relationship plays in driving change as we begin to think of rebuilding around these three key areas? Education system, I'm so glad we've talked a lot about that, so I'm not going to dwell on that a lot, but one of the things I want to challenge us to begin to look at as we dismantle systems in the education, as we expand our curriculum. I wonder if there might be a call for many more of us to get into the education system if we want to really create change. For those who are not in the system right now, is this a call to think about how can I go in and change that system? Perhaps how can we have many more males who are going to act as role models? Because somehow I always talk about I want to talk the talk, but also walk the walk. And I'm hoping that I'm not talking to already people in the system, but I'm talking to people who are not in the system as well, who want to be able to create change. It might be that we, particularly when we think about the effects of COVID, knowing that there are groups who are already disadvantaged, who've also lost skills in these last 6 months, what are we doing over the summer holiday? That's how do we think about, is there an opportunity, for example, that we create lots of formal/informal settings where we are bringing our children up to speed to be ready for the September term, or perhaps they can run alongside each other. That's part of breaking the cycle. We want our children who are already disadvantaged, how can we close that gap? How can we create systems? How can we make the education system a lot more robust so that those children who are already disadvantaged almost come up to par with their peers or be where they are meant to be? And I feel, I genuinely, there's a need for all coming into the education system. I wonder also how much we think about our community groups and what role our community groups can play in breaking the system, in changing the system. You know, those grassroots levels, those grassroots groups where we know that those informal groups are so incredibly helpful in building character, in building resilience, in building those non-cognitive skills that are so important if we want our children to progress in life. You know, those community-based groups that are usually based around relationship, like the faith groups, the local diaspora groups, street pastors, school pastors, you know, or even the informal coffee chat that happens across generations that somehow COVID has even prevented. How do we get those systems back up and running if we are wanting to create change in every sector? And like I keep saying, this has to be just beyond the classrooms. These are things that should be happening in our communities. that maybe somehow no legislation will tell us to do it, but knowing what we know and knowing how much our communities have been left behind, how do we robustly invest in these areas to ensure that our children are built up, that our children are no longer left behind? Or when it comes to business, for example, my big challenge to business, and I know, and I'm going to show you a video in a minute that really brings this to life, where business, and we maybe both us as business owners, and again, this is a call to anyone who's listening. What are we doing as businesses to support our young people? You know, in a time of recession, I know that so many nice to have schemes, you suddenly disappear. I know there's a lot of money being pumped into 18 to 25s right now because of this season, and I think it might be on for about a year. But what happens after that? What happens when all the noise of COVID is probably gone and businesses have so much focus on just rebuilding? Again, these young people who are already disadvantaged are the ones who are left behind. So my charge, my encouragement to businesses is that we never forget the role of mentoring. We need our young people to dream. We need our young people to see themselves in businesses. There are, you know, my office is in London, like I said earlier, and a lot of times when we do work, even in a community like Tower Hamlet, you have young people who would look over at Canary Wharf and would say, I can never see myself there. And my charge to those businesses all the time is to say, you have to create room, you have to build bridges. We need to be building bridges so that every young person should never, ever, young people should never see a place and say, I can never do that, I can never be there, I can never walk in that place. And this is a call that even in businesses, as we are rebuilding, we need to look at those practices within our businesses, where perhaps a certain group of persons are excluded because they're not a cultural fit, because they do not look like they belong here. And as we look at every sector of our society, but right from education to our communities, to our businesses, that we create relationships that bridges these gaps. Relationship based on the ethos of mentoring, where young people are no longer, you know, I use the word the luxury of hope, because sometimes it feels like only a certain person can dream. And I hate that we have a society, I truly hate that we have a society that hope is a luxury item. But I think that as we are rebuilding our communities and our society, and as we are breaking the cycle that held communities back, that we think about mentoring as a key driver across these three areas, across education, community, and businesses. You know, I know, as I started off saying that I love the fact that I'm lucky, or I feel blessed that I live in a place where I have the woods around me. I know, however, that I can't, as much as I've had 4 months to be at home and tending to my house, my garden. There's a tendency for us as individuals, when all this noise is died down, that we constantly look after our own house and we ignore the land in which our house is built. And my charge to us is that when we think about breaking down the cycle, that we look across at our land, our communities, and that we put in place structures, we put in place bridges that helps break that circle that helps break those circles that has kept people bound. I want to end with a video, and I'm hoping this will
Today we are at the country's first National Youth Mentoring Summit to mark our 20th anniversary.
This summit is driven by the need to create the space and the opportunity for dialogue. It's an opportunity to bring together organizations, governments, and of course key stakeholders like the royal family.
The impact of a mentor has the power to make society richer, happier, kinder, and more aligned.
I have seen thousands of times across the year a life changed by means of another person who gives most generously of the thing that costs most, their time. It's about bringing hope and the gifts and skills that you have, the world that we all have the privilege of inhabiting.
We're here to try and encourage the private sector to take more responsibility. We need to find how we can reach more people, because mentoring is incredibly important.
Just listening to all of you talk today, it's got this fire in my belly.
I am urging businesses and organisations to pledge their commitment to mentoring and unlock a resource which can transform society.
Being a Dynawood mentee helps me to take risks, to see that our work has actually took off and people are listening. It does show it can make a change.
My mother, Princess Diana, was a role model to so many without realising the impact she would have on so many lives. You don't have to be a princess or a public figure to be a role model.
Being in the mentor program, I don't think I would be here today if it weren't for that first 10 weeks of mentoring.
We've worked with over 4,000 young people. They were telling me how inspired they were just hearing the stories of others. This is why we do this.
To the mentees here today, I am incredibly proud of what you've achieved. I can safely say that my mother, who would have turned 58 yesterday, would feel the same. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And, I'm just going to end with saying that mentoring is really key in breaking the cycle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessie, for sharing your story with us. You've given us so much food for thought, and thank you for providing us and giving us guidance on how we can make change individually. That's not something that we often hear. Thank you very much.